All right, y'all. Welcome back to class this week. Welcome to a classroom in Benicia Hall at Sac State. Decided to change the classroom this time, but I'm going to go ahead and do the last bit of lecturing for this week at Sac State to get you all taken care of for the week. So as I discussed in earlier lectures from this week, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of housing discrimination in Sacramento. And that's because some of you all express interest in this, not only because of your own sociological imagination papers, and ways to explore self, but just because of a broader interest in kind of this idea of housing discrimination and maybe how it impacted your local neighborhoods and communities. So we're certainly not going to be talking about all communities in the Sacramento region. It'd be kind of hard to do that in, a 50-minute, hour-long lecture or so, whatever this may be. But we're going to talk in broad strokes, at least, about the history of housing segregation and how this fits into the conversations we've been having around redlining, blockbusting, racial covenants, and other things. We're not going to talk about all of those terms and concepts. We're going to focus in on a few key things, which is basically redlining, steering to some degree, and gentrification. And so that's going to be our main focus for the Sacramento discussion. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So there we go. The history of housing segregation in Sacramento starts with redlining and blockbusting in the 1920s and 1950s. That process, really kind of this history in Sacramento, starts with a gentleman by the name of J.C. Carley, who was the founder of the Sacramento Real Estate Board. And he basically takes a bunch of farmland that comprised the Sacramento region, or the greater Sacramento region, or what would become the greater Sacramento region, and subdivides it for residential development. So he's the first person to buy up a large chunk of land in the Sacramento region that was primarily used for farming and subdivides it to start creating the neighborhoods that we would kind of come to know today. When he starts to do this, J.C. Carley very clearly follows the guidelines of the National Association for Real Estate Boards, or the NAREB. The NAREB was an organization that honored pre-existing restrictive covenants. So this is one of the organizations that were acting very racially and racist at the time. And when J.C. Carley comes into Sacramento and starts subdividing farmlands, he honors the NAREB's racist policies of creating racially restrictive covenants. Why? Well, again, remember, this is a time period, much like the other areas we talked about with Detroit and the 8 Mile Wall, with Durham, North Carolina, with many cities around the United States. The same logics and reasons they're following redlining and blockbusting practices and all these other practices is because they're trying to set up these communities to maximize kind of wealth building potential, to maximize purchasability, but for particular families, wealth building for particular families being white families, and wealth accumulation in white communities. And of course, usually these racially restrictive covenants makes that possible. You cannot sell your house to anybody else but another white person under these covenants, under these restrictions, which of course assures that whatever properties that J.C. Carley is creating here in Sacramento are going to follow some racist principles and logics. One, because that means that J.C. Carley knows that they can now guarantee FHA home loans. Remember that racially restricted covenants or things that proved that the community would be effectively white only made it so that they would be green lined, or made it so that they would be have FHA home loans as being a possibility, made it so that insurance companies were going to be much more happy and much more likely to insure these properties. And so that same logic that we've explored in other places in the nation very really is coming to play here in Sacramento as well. It also requires agents to provide templates for new racially restrictive covenants for new development. So this means that with regards to this property that particularly J.C. Carley is developing, because he's buying into the NAREB, he's also buying into or agreeing to their principles and processes of creating racially restrictive covenants and requiring racially restrictive covenants for the properties that he is now building in this farmland that he's turning in to the early neighborhoods of the Sacramento region. So he's very really building Sacramento along the same racist and racialized lines that many other places in the country are building their neighborhoods and communities at the same time. A lot of people like to imagine in many ways the history of racism in California is different than it is in other parts around the nation. People want to believe or imagine the U.S. South as the racist part of the U.S. history. Indeed, racism, racialization, and racial discrimination were prevalent in all parts of the United States, including very much here in California, and here even more locally in our own city where we're living, or the region that we're living of Sacramento. The redlining processes also are brought in by J.C. Carly and other members of the community during this time. Indeed, there were New Deal housing programs that mandated the use of racially restricted covenants as a condition of loan approval, right? So the New Deal itself had these requirements that basically said that if you don't make these racially restrictive covenants, or you don't use them, that you can get that FHA loan approval, right? So going back to this logic of, it's not just something people were doing, this is literally something that the federal government is mandating, is requiring people to follow if they want to be able to get first-time home buyers these really nice, lucrative, sweet property purchasing agreements, these loans that are going to be very favorable, that makes it much more likely that a first-time home buyer will buy a home in your neighborhood, in your community. And so FHA financing both aided the construction and sale of new homes here in Sacramento, precisely because J.C. Carly decided to follow all the rules and regulations that were in place that allowed it that these homes can be bought with FHA home loans, that they would be insurable, that in other words, that Sacramento followed the same racially restrictive kind of guidelines that other places were, that there were some very clearly neighborhoods that were white only, restricted to white people, and covered by practices that allowed for FHA home loans. And there were communities of color, particularly Latinx and Black communities, that were excluded and alienated, not able to live in houses that would be insured, and not be able to buy houses through FHA home loans. That to the degree they were able to buy houses, they were also buying them in a similar way that we were talking about subprime loans, with very different loan terms that made it much less likely, for them to be able to buy a home in the first place, or if they did, make it much more an expensive endeavor for them because they weren't getting these sweet FHA loans that came with much more lucrative and favorable terms. And so compliance with these practices of redlining and the use of blockbusting to kind of create neighborhoods in which Black families were more likely to live and white families were more likely to live, to the degree that they would kind of sometimes shift community members from one neighborhood to the other. One of the tools that were used to do this and kind of create these well racially divided neighborhoods in Sacramento was that historical process of blockbusting, literally going in and scaring people, white people, out of communities that were racially mixed or that were being kind of created to be racially mixed, and into these white only communities. So some city blocks in the West End, the West End being kind of one of the redlined areas in Sacramento, were reported as having 90 to 99% of dwelling units occupied by non-whites by 1940. Indeed, because we were creating these racially restrictive covenants, and all the good FHA home loans and all the good insurance were going to people that were willing to move in that neighborhood. And of course, you could only move in that neighborhood you were white. So white people were moving in there into the green line neighborhoods, getting taken care of with loans, getting taken care of with insurance. We were subsequently pushing Black families and families of color into these redline communities, in which about 90 to 99% of people living on any given block or any given region of what was known as the West End were families of color, Black families in particular, but certainly also Latinx families in large numbers, Native American families in large numbers as well. This fact was very clearly made out in documents attributed in part to the housing restrictions imposed by racially restrictive covenants. Indeed, as Jesus Hernandez, a urban sociologist, points out, that when you go into all of the data about the history of Sacramento and all of the evidence as they're talking about this history of kind of racial discrimination in Sacramento, a lot of it very clearly says that this West End in particular was created as a result of racially restrictive covenants that prevented Black families or families of color from moving to certain neighborhoods and basically forced them into neighborhoods like the West End. Racially restrictive covenants also made it hard for Black families, regardless of class position, to move out of that neighborhood. Again, even if you were a rich Black family or a rich Latinx family, if that neighborhood that you wanted to move into had a racially restrictive covenant, well, it didn't matter how much money you had, you didn't fit the bill, you didn't fit the profile, right? So you were forced to move into a neighborhood like the West End, where that property you were buying, that property you were buying into was losing value, right? Because we know that these racialized neighborhoods, that white neighborhoods would increase in property value, increase in desirability over time, while the Black neighborhoods, because of lack of investment, because of lack of insurability, because of lack of loan approval to get loans for people to even buy into that community, those houses were quickly losing value, losing investment, and kind of becoming more dilapidated over time, right? So even if you were a well-off community member in that neighborhood and you can afford to take care of your neighbor, your house, right? If your neighbor's house and your neighbor's house and your neighbor's house is falling apart, your property value is declining regardless of how well you're taking care of your property, because your neighbors can't afford to take care of their property and because they're not getting proper investment or government support or insurance support to do the things they need to do to make sure their properties are well protected, well insured, and well taken care of in terms of even just being able to invest, because the jobs weren't also in these communities. The jobs conveniently were also in the white communities, and those white communities not only just had racially restrictive covenants that didn't allow people to move there, but we're also implementing in many ways what were known as sundown laws that effectively said that Black people aren't really welcome here past sundown. But the reality is even though they said you're not welcome here past sundown, it was really sending a signal, you're not welcome here at all. And of course, the jobs are there and you're not welcome there. Well, what happens? You don't get those jobs. You don't get access to the good lucrative jobs that people that are living in those communities are. You're getting access to whatever's left over, and whatever's left over is almost always lower paying jobs that barely pay the bills, let alone allow you to take care of your house, take care of your property, to invest in it, to build new rooms, to repaint it, to keep it looking nice and pristine. So Blacks were thus contained in the boundaries of the West End, where their financial investments in property were losing money year to year, right? And so while white families were gaining money intergenerationally, they were building wealth intergenerationally because they were in these neighborhoods that, of course, were increasing in property value. Their wealth is increasing here in Sacramento, while people living in the West End, their wealth is staying stagnant or declining as a result of that very different neighborhood situation that at least for Black people, it was not about choice, but lack thereof. There are many people that probably could have afforded a house in one of these newer communities, but were restricted literally because of these racially restrictive covenants from moving in there. All right. So the West End, just so you know, for those of us that know Sacramento, most of us should, is the area northwest of downtown Sacramento. So the area kind of close to the river. And to the north, which would mean to the Reading side, for those of you that know, or a way that you can kind of think about this would be if you know where the old railroad yard is, the old Pacific Union Railroad, or if you're going towards basically where the Arco Arena used to be, that's the north side, so the northwest side near that river, right? So if you're driving down 5 and you pass the ballpark and you're headed towards where Arco is, that's the side we're talking about there. That was what was known as the West End. All right. Basically, there was a drastic decline in property values from 38 to 49. So that while Sacramento property overall saw a 46% increase in value overall, red line areas, including the West End, saw a 30% decrease in property value. So there you go, right? When you're looking at Sacramento in terms of wealth accumulation, in terms of owning properties, Overall in Sacramento, we increased by 46%. Buying in Sacramento and building in Sacramento was very lucrative for many families that were moving here and trying to make life when J.C. Carly was building these new properties, these new possibilities. However, it wasn't so lucrative for Black families or families of color that were living in red line communities like the West End, where they weren't getting access to this wealth accumulation. In fact, they were losing wealth by being forced to live in the neighborhoods that they were restricted to because they couldn't move into the neighborhoods that were building wealth, even if they could afford to. Housing market participation or lack thereof makes a difference. Whether you can gain access to these neighborhoods or not makes the difference as to whether you're going to get access to this wealth building or not. In other words, racially restrictive covenants decides whether you can participate in the market, whether you even have access to the market. Even if you have the money, you're still restricted from participating in the market otherwise. So the West End properties were often converted into multi-dwelling properties at this time also to increase occupancy and therefore rent. One of the things that was happening was that instead of many Black families that were moving into the West End even owning the properties, more often than not, they became renters, or they were forced into becoming renters because white families that were living in the other neighborhoods, these other kind of richer, more racially, well, not more, racially restricted neighborhoods, were also using this wealth accumulation they were getting, this increase in money, this increase in wealth that they were building up, to buy properties, including in the West End, and they were basically building what would be known as slums, right? They were building these kinds of neighborhoods, these kinds of buildings where you can fit many people into a confined space, large apartment buildings, basically studio apartment type situations in which you can fit large amounts of people there, not really investing in taking care of the property, not really do anything to make this a nice living experience for people living there. Oh, no. They're just trying to maximize the amount of people they can fit in the smallest amount of space possible to maximize their rent seeking, the amount of money they can gain for rent. So they started transforming these neighborhoods from single dwelling houses to multi-tenant dwellings. So to the degree that the West End, at least initially, even as kind of racially segregated as it was still maybe okay for some families because they were still, single dwelling homes. They were much like, the houses that we see in our neighborhoods today. Those houses more and more started disappearing as white investors started snapping up those houses, being able to afford those houses, as people would lose them or would move out because they were tired of facing racism, whatever it was, when those properties were sold, because you had to be able to afford that buy the property to buy it. White investors were snapping it up, destroying the housing, and turning it into basically slum apartments is the most effective way to kind of describe what they were creating, and very intentionally so. All right, so during World War II, going into the 1940s, there was, much like other places in the United States, an influx of people of color to Sacramento. The reason for that is because Black Americans, because of Executive Order 1942, were allowed to work at military installations. And here in Sacramento, we had two very powerful Air Force bases throughout most of the 20th century until they both effectively closed during the Clinton administration, during the back end of the 20th century, essentially. That was Mather Air Force Base, which was out by Rancho Cordova, and McClellan Air Force Base, which was one of only 5 Air Force logistics bases that were open at the time, that was open out near North Highlands. So a lot of Black families started to move here for one of the kind of rare middle-class job opportunities they had, which was working at military installations, military bases, especially during World War II when we're in the middle of a war. So we need all the bodies we can to help move goods, move services, transport people, transport everything we do. And McClellan, like I said, was a logistics base. A logistics base means they were supplying, uniforms, guns, bombs, everything they needed to the military overseas that was fighting this war. And of course, McClellan is a key base in our fight against Japan, right? Because that's on the Pacific coast and Japan's on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. And so McClellan was a key place for a lot of movement of soldiers and equipment was coming in and out of. And so Black families were moving here to try to get in on this kind of lucrative potential opportunity for middle-class jobs, right? Another thing that was happening at the same time was the labor importation program in 1942, otherwise known as the Bracero Act. You watched the video about the Bracero Act, and the Bracero Act certainly had an impact in the influx of people coming from Mexico and from Latin America into Sacramento as well. Then they were also looking for these same opportunities, either working at military facilities or working at factories that were kind of all over the place in Sacramento, including one being this building you're looking at here, which is now known as the Cannery. It's a bunch of offices. It actually used to be a Campbell soup factory. Or no, actually, I think it was Libby, which is vegetables. Yeah, Libby sounds right. Libby, which was vegetables, right? What it was a big canning industry factory that many of these workers, these Black workers and these Latinx workers that were coming into Sacramento were working at. Nonetheless, they were still being forced in to the West End as their living result. So these racially restrictive covenants and redlining processes forced these immigrants, whether they were Black immigrants coming from the U.S. South or Latinx and particularly Mexican immigrants coming from Mexico, right, that were coming to Sacramento to try to gain access to work. They, much like the people that had come before them that were people of color and families of color, were still forced to move in the already crowded West End. So the West End becomes more and more crowded. It becomes more and more people in less and less space because they cannot, due to racially restrictive covenants, live anywhere else in Sacramento, but the few places that they're effectively allowed to live. So this leads to, of course, declining property values. You have a lot of people trying to share a little space. A lot of people sharing a little space is going to lead to unfortunate kind of declining value because, the more a space gets used, the more, it gets declined. You get a bunch of people walking across the carpet. You get a bunch of people using a building, right? That building's going to start declining because of usage, just because of pure usage, right? It's going to become more and more used, more and more old, et cetera, at a faster and faster rate. And so property deterioration really was what was mostly responsible for this declining property value because of forced overuse, because they were being forced to have so many people living in these communities, right? However, the West End is not necessarily, if we go to the West End today, it's not the same as it used to be back at this time, right? If we think about the West End today, now it's a train yard. Now it's, the Amtrak runs out of there. You have a lot of state offices. You actually have the Sacramento County Jail within the area that used to be the West End, right? And the West End actually starts to bump up into what is now the Golden One Center. That would be kind of on the border, if not actually part of the West End. I don't know exactly where the borders were, but reasonably speaking, the Golden One Center would definitely be on at least the border, if not actually in part of the West End. And so the West End clearly isn't what it used to be, right? In other words, things have shifted remarkably. And so one of the questions we have to ask is what caused that historic shift to where the West End, this place in which predominantly communities of color, 90 to 99% of people living there were families of color, people of color, what turned that situation around into where it's now offices and a train yard and an Amtrak station and a sports arena, et cetera, et cetera? Well, the answer to that is urban renewal, or what was known as the Urban Renewal Program, which was a program created by the federal government, particularly through the Federal Housing Act of 1949, which was this act that was designed and created to eliminate substandard housing. So in many places of the country, just like Sacramento, there were communities like the West End that the nation was more and more unable to kind of deny their existence, deny the reality of them. And indeed, we are also coming out of the period of World War II, in which we're trying to tell people that, people should be free and people should be independent and people should be able to, make their own decisions and make their own choices, right? And so we're telling other people around the globe, freedom's important and freedom of choice is important, and allowing people to make the most of themselves and have individual opportunities important, while we're living in a period or in a country in which we're not honoring that because of our racist history and our racist past. And so this country, and kind of wrestling with this thing, kind of realizing that the narrative we're telling other countries and other people around the world how they should behave in the act, this idea of freedom, this idea of individual choice, it's not something we're necessarily honoring at home. And so we're wrestling with that in a way that we're trying to now, say, well, if this is what we're selling effectively as a cultural idea overseas, we really need to be practicing what we preach. And so the federal government was starting to shift narratives or change things to kind of address this history of racism at home. Now, did they do it perfectly? No, of course not, because there wasn't necessarily a drive to do it perfectly. What they were trying to do was address it in a way that minimized it enough that made other people around the world go, oh, okay, yeah, you all are good now, while still maximizing in many ways the racist history and the racist privilege to the advantage of the people that were always advantaged by it, which would have been white Americans. But within this kind of process and within this kind of cultural narrative that's being constructed in the United States and what they're trying to sell, like I said, the Federal Housing Act of 1949 comes into place, which is designed to eliminate substandard housing and create subsidies for cities trying to remedy housing shortages. So the idea here is actually to address situations like the West End, to make sure that people that were living in these communities that were substandard, that were dilapidated, that were clearly not good for people's health and well-being, either mentally or physically, that clearly were not interested in helping people build wealth and build kind of an income. The idea behind this law was to change that, to fix that, to remedy that. So initially, it was focused on improving housing in so-called blighted communities or communities like the West End. But by 1954, an amendment was introduced that eased restrictions of funding to be primarily for housing. So initially, the funding that was coming in for this 1949 Federal Housing Act was designed to tear down these slum apartment buildings essentially and build housing, to build houses, to go back to those single dwelling houses, to build people nice communities they can live in. But within 5 years, enough corporations had kind of got their voice into the equation, their voice into kind of shaping this new urban renewal policy to get them to ease those restrictions, those requirements to build houses, and actually got the federal government to create an amendment that allowed them to do something very different. And that something very different led to a very different outcome than what was initially intended by this 1940 Act, which was creating housing for these communities that had been historically denied housing, creating, in other words, the same opportunity to live the same way that white families have been living for generations. Oh, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do something else, and we'll take care of them along the way, but let's try this a different way. So what do? Well, this change in the law basically created a situation in which, instead of tearing down these apartment buildings and building single dwelling homes, or basically building suburb communities, much like the communities that white families were living in, instead they tore those communities down and built what we know is in the West End today, right? Office buildings, business buildings, places where people can do work, places where people can run businesses, not where places where people can live, right? So instead of actually fixing the situation, which is what the initial law was meant to do by providing them quality housing and the same living experiences and the same living opportunities that white families had in places like Sacramento or other places around the nation, what they did was not only did they not remedy that situation, but they made it worse by, instead of tearing down these apartments and at least building new apartments there that were in new condition. No. They tore down the houses. They eliminated the housing that was there and replaced it with offices and businesses. That meant that these people got nothing in return. Not only did they lose their house, they lose where they were living, but it wasn't replaced like it was supposed to be with another place to live that was going to be nicer and more like what white people had experienced all along. And so what happens as this West End is torn down and it's replaced by businesses and is replaced by, even in some cases, housing, but housing that's now being marketed to and sold to people that can afford it, which is, of course, they're marking up the prices on it. They're making this new housing that they're building very nice, but also very unaffordable for people who remember, as they were living in the West End, they weren't building wealth, right? They were losing wealth. They lost 30% of their wealth. At the same time, Sacramento gained 46% of wealth overall. So these people couldn't afford to buy into these new houses, these new properties that were being built in there, along with all this kind of business and office and all of this nice stuff that was being built. And so the non-white residents dropped to 5.4% in the West End by 1970. Well, the question is, where did they go, right? Where did they go in Sacramento, since they were basically now being told, you're no longer living here, we're destroying this to build the offices? So before I answer that question, let me just go ahead and show you what the West End ends up looking like during this period. So 1951 is the image on the left. You can see some kind of housing. You can see some kind of apartment building type structures in there. That's basically an aerial shot of the West End as it existed in 1951. By 1965, 14 years later, you notice the significant difference that we're seeing here. What you're seeing here is basically the destruction of all the housing and replacement with the offices and with the buildings that are more familiar to us as we go to that area of downtown Sacramento today. And certainly by the 1980s, a lot of that housing had been destroyed, as you're seeing in 1965. But what replaced it over the next 30 years was effectively offices, businesses, all of those things that we're more familiar with as being part of that community now, as well as with larger properties, larger houses that were really only affordable by families that had been building up wealth as a result of this wealth boom in Sacramento that didn't impact Black communities, right? They were experiencing wealth decline, Latinx families' wealth decline, white families' wealth increase, right? So they can afford the nice new properties being built here, while the Black families were being forced out. So where did they go? Well, this is where we get the birth of what we now know as Oak Park, or the kind of, the Oak Park that we know it as today. But I call it the rebirth of Oak Park because for those of you that don't know, when Oak Park was built, it was actually one of the racially restrictive communities, one of the racially restrictive covenant communities. Historically, it was actually a community for affluent white people. But as Black people were being forced out of the West End, well, they started the what? They started the blockbusting process in Oak Park. So as the Black families were being forced out of the West End because of urban renewal, real estate agents were taking them over to Oak Park because Oak Park was now an older community. The housing, is 40, 50, 60 years old at this point. So the white families that had been building wealth in that community, had been making and doing well financially in that community, were ready to move out into newer housing, right? And so they facilitated this process by taking Black families that had literally lost their house or weren't going to house their house anymore, move them into Oak Park, remembering that they're exploiting them. Oh yeah, we're going to move you into this white community. Look at this white community. Yeah, it's no longer racially restrictive. We're not doing that anymore. To move you over here, but this is a well-off community, so it's going to cost you a little more to buy in, but it's going to be worth it, right? Because you're going to have a mixed race community. Things are going to be great. Look at Oak Park. Look at all these amenities. Look at all these services. Look at all these great things that are happening, right? Then they knock on that white family's door that's living in Oak Park. Hey, did you see that Black family that moved in next door? Yeah, y'all might want to pack up and go. If you were thinking about moving in that new neighborhood we're building down the road in Carmichael, in Fair Oaks, in Orangevale, and all the other places that we're now developing at a rapid pace. Well, now's your time because you certainly want to get out before this neighborhood changes, right? So real estate agents were using the destruction of the West End and the kind of the nature of Oak Park being one of the older communities now in Sacramento to create a blockbusting situation, which then get white families to invest in new houses at more expensive rates so they can make their money there by getting white families over there. They can make their money by exploiting Black families having to be moved into Oak Park because they're literally being forced out of the West End. And so the real estate agents are exploiting this as a financially lucrative process on both ends of the scales. They're exploiting white people by literally scaring them out of their houses in Oak Park, even those that didn't want to move out of Oak Park that were perfectly happy and content being there. And they're exploiting Black families by also selling the properties that they know are going to be, because they're creating this situation, a declining property value situation once again, because it's going to be an almost exclusively Black community that all of those amenities and services are saying, hey, look at everything's here. All those things are going to start disappearing and going to Carmichael and going to Fair Oaks and going to Orangevale and going to Folsom and going to Roseville, right? And no longer going to be in Oak Park because, of course, those things are going to follow with the white communities. They're going to go where those white communities are. To the degree that they're staying in downtown, white people are commuting in and out of downtown to access those good state jobs, for instance, while Black people are still being discriminated and getting access to this, right? And so the rebirth of Oak Park is basically the result of thousands of Black people being evicted from the West End during the urban renewal and being forced into Oak Park, along with this kind of arrival of many Black families and Latinx families that are looking for a place to stay because they're working at the military base, they're working at the canning factory, they need a place to stay. West End is no longer doing it. We're going to move you into Oak Park instead. So that accelerates this process, and that accelerates this kind of shifting demographic change in Oak Park. The racially restrictive covenants and during this time and redlining were starting to be challenged. People were starting to kind of challenge the legality, the morality of these things, but really to minimal effect. Most of the kinds of challenges weren't really effective. Racially restrictive covenants at this period in time were still being more or less maintained. And so these Black families, as I said, were primarily being moved to older, non-restricted neighborhoods in Sacramento, Oak Park being one of them. Oak Park was historically restricted, had become unrestricted as real estate agents started playing this blockbusting game. So Oak Park in 1950 was 6.5% non-white. By 1970, just 5 years later, it was 48% non-white. So a very quick change in demographics, right, as a result of this process, right? So racial steering, as well as covenants and redlining, and this process of blockbusting plays this role. There's a couple of quotes from people, from Oak Park residents that kind of help us illuminate or get at what's going on here. One of which, but what do they, back then when I was a young man, they had something called the redliners. And Blacks couldn't buy out in this area. So what they did, a Black would get a white person to get the home for them. Then they would move in. Then they would somehow take the title later. So one of the things they were saying is Oak Park was a community that was supposed to be prevented from Black people moving in. So whether it was a real estate agent blockbusting them in, or basically Black people having maybe a white friend or a white person that was at least willing to help them out and buy the house for them, right? Or get the title of the house for them and then kind of hand it over to them later in an under the table deal. The way they were gaining access was kind of skirting the system, or having a real estate agent, purposely manipulate the system to get in there. So it wasn't an easy shift or an easy process. There was definitely this intentional shift that was created. Another quote, "We were lucky to find our house. We rented a small house in the back of our landlord's house on 3rd Avenue. When she evicted a renter from the house she owned next door, we asked her if we could buy it. She called her attorney, who wrote up some kind of contract, and we made the payments right to her. I don't remember seeing any paperwork until we paid the house off. Then she sent us the papers that said we owned the house. We bought our second house on 11th Avenue the same way." Again, kind of under the market dealings that get Black families and Latinx family into Oak Park, at least initially, along with real estate agents doing this blockbusting thing that fundamentally shape and shift and alter the racial demographics of Oak Park. So these two images on the slide are actually images of Oak Park back in the day when we had trolley lines going through Oak Park. Sacramento used to be great for public transportation. There was trolley trains that ran all up and down. And of course, those trolley trains are gone. This kind of like classic feeling of Oak Park is gone as a result of what? Well, once the white people left, we weren't going to keep funding the public transportation, all these nice amenities into that community, that all of this stuff got destroyed and taken out or got defunded, right, as a result of basically this demographic transition and all of those amenities and all those nice services, once again, following white families into the new communities that they were building in other places. So racially restricted neighborhood communities remained predominantly white, and racially restrictive covenants ended up showing up in other places in Sacramento until they were eventually outlawed to kind of maintain the old status quo. Now you had West Park as your this is where Black people, Latino people, families of color go, and we're going to racially restrict them from other areas of these newer areas being rebuilt, including the old neighborhood they used to live in, the West End. The West End also became racially exclusive to a great degree as a result of these shifts and changes. So redlining and blockbusting were very much working hand in hand to create this manipulation or this shift to the advantage of white families, and once again to the advantage of Black